अस्सलामु अलैकुम वरहमतुल्लाहि वबरकातुहू। उम्मीद है आप सब लोग खैरियत से होंगे। एक नए पॉडकास्ट में एक नई शख्सियत के साथ आपकी खिदमत में हाज़िर हैं। जैसा कि हम जानते हैं, हमारा माशरा जिस तरीके से चेंज हो रहा है, इवॉल्व हो रहा है, और जिस तरीके से एक टेक्नोलॉजिकल एडवांसमेंट ने इस पूरी दुनिया को घेरे में लिया, तो उससे माशरती अक़दार तो हमारी ख़राब हो ही रही थी। उसके साथ साथ हमारे और जो कई माशरती मसाइल, जो सोशल प्रॉब्लम्स, साइकोलॉजिकल, रिलीजियस, क्रीड बेस्ड प्रॉब्लम हैं, वो भी मंजर आम पे आना शुरू हो गए, जो कि इससे पहले इतने ज़्यादा प्रिवेल नहीं थे हमारी सोसाइटी के अंदर। तो उन्हीं टॉपिक्स को इंशाल्लाह आज हम इस पॉडकास्ट के अंदर डिस्कस करेंगे। आज हमारे मेहमान हमारे साथ हैं हमज़ा ज़ोर्ज़िस, जो कि माशाल्लाह यूके से हमारे पास तशरीफ़ लेके आए हैं और पाकिस्तान में डिफरेंट वर्कशॉप्स और सेशंस यूनिवर्सिटीज़ में और प्राइवेटली उसको अटेंड भी कर रहे हैं, उसको कंडक्ट कर रहे हैं। अस्सलामु अलैकुम। How are you, brother? How are you doing?
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
So before digging deep into the various topic, I just wanted to know, it's your third visit, right?
It is my third visit.
Okay, so how do you find Pakistani people, and how do you differentiate this region to any other region of the world?
Very good, beautiful. Pakistani people have a lot of passion. They're very spiritual and they have a huge potential. I've said this before on the record that I truly believe that Pakistan has the potential to lead the ummah. Absolutely, the potential. Not now, but it does have the resources, the manpower, the capability, and the potential to lead the ummah, inshallah. And I feel if there's an alignment of values, and we go back to I say our because the Pakistan project was an ummatic project.
Exactly.
Because it was for La ilaha illallah, right? So when we go back to our original idea, then I think it's going to be khair for Pakistan and khair for the world, because Islam is a rahmah, it's a mercy, and it's justice for every living being. So there's huge potential here.
So if we talk about the atheism in Pakistan, so what I believe, that atheism in Pakistan is more emotional as compared to the atheism in the Western countries. So is it true like that?
Well, there is an argument that you can say that Western atheism is emotional as well. They've just learned the art of veiling it with pseudo-intellectual arguments. So I understand what you're saying. There's more of a kind of, if you want to use the words, intellectual, academic framing of their atheism. And generally speaking, atheism in Pakistan is more social and emotional. What I mean by that is, for example, you may have the elite class and they may have liberal, secular, atheistic tendencies for non-intellectual reasons, right? Now, unfortunately, I think what's happening in Pakistan is that you have a growing atheism on campus, you have a growing atheism amongst the secular elites, but now you have an atheism amongst the poor. Because Marxism, or neo-Marxism, is slowly entering the lower classes in Pakistan. But yes, I would agree in general that it's more emotional and social, because if you look at the secular elites, generally speaking, it's a secular and kind of godless worldview. I mean, I wouldn't say godless society because that has negative connotations, because there are people in society that actually believe in God in the West and they are good people in terms of their behaviors. But generally, the worldview, the ideology is godless. And also, there are forms of atheism in the West. So they will see that and they will be like, oh, we need to be like that. Now, the reason they say this is not because of an intellectual position, it's because of a sociological or psycho-social position. What do I mean by that? Human beings have a need to belong. And if you study social conformity, there is something called normative social influence. And normative social influence is that you have a need to belong. And in order to get that belonging, you would basically submit to the dominant group. Now, amongst the secular elites, the dominant group for them is the West, or the elites within their group that look towards the West. So for them to get a sense of belonging, they would adopt the dominant group's behaviors or even ideas. And that's what normative social influence is about, social conformity. So they're conforming because they have a need to belong. That could be the case. And I have spoken, I think, to at least one or more of these type of people. And to be honest, they don't have any arguments. It's quite pathetic, to be honest. It's pseudo-intellectual arguments.
Okay, so this question I'm going to ask on the behalf of our listeners and our students, basically those who doubted on the existence of God. So how can we rationally prove the existence of God, that He exists and He is there for us?
I mean, there are many good arguments for the existence of God, but I usually tend to use the argument in the Quran. And generally speaking, the Quran doesn't really address atheism. It addresses it, but its focus is not on atheism. Its focus is on Tawheed, meaning who is worthy of worship, affirming the attributes of Allah, affirming His divinity, His creative agency.
Oneness of Allah, basically.
And the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His unicity, yeah? So when it comes to the Quran, maybe one or two places it directly talks about atheism. For example, chapter 52, verses 35 to 36. Did you come from nothing? Did you create yourself? Did you create the heavens and the earth? Indeed, you don't have any certainty. Now, from that, you could develop a universal argument for God's existence. And you could argue, did the universe come from nothing? Did it create itself? Was it created by something else created? Or was it created by an uncreated creator? And we don't have to go into the argument now, but it's a very powerful argument. I just delivered it just about an hour ago at UMT. It's a powerful, intuitive, rational, and also spiritual argument. So I usually use that argument, the argument from the Quran, because the best arguments are from the Quran.
When we see the Western academia, they are more on godless values. And in our region, in our education system, they are under influence by Western academia. So, do you believe that our education system and our academia directly or indirectly programming us to become a godless person, basically?
Possibly. I think it's more likely to be the case because, when people think about Western academia, sometimes people are very naive. They think it's objective. It's like wahi, yeah? It's objective. It's just concerned with truth. That's not true. The Western academy has its own epistemological and metaphysical assumptions. Yeah, generally speaking, it's based on some form of philosophical skepticism. So there is an assumption of that in the discourse. It promotes that form of skepticism, and that can lead to, for example, denying God if you follow that kind of the implications of that assumption in a particular way. But I think what's important to understand is in Western academia, you also have people who promote theism. They have arguments for God's existence. So there is there's a plethora of ideas and a myriad of ideas that are even maybe in conflict. So it would be a bit harsh to say that the Western academy or academia is designed to make you godless or designed to make an atheist. However, it is true, you can say in general, the Western academy has certain assumptions, epistemological and metaphysical, that if you adopt them can lead to denial of God or can lead to the denial of religion or the distortion of religion, for sure. So maybe the right way of framing the question is to basically say some aspects of Western academia are used to promote atheism. Yes, that would be maybe a better framing, especially in a Pakistani context. And so, because in some cases, for example, take the philosophy of the mind in Western academia. Generally speaking, you could speak about anything apart from God, right? Yes, there are arguments for God's existence from consciousness. There are people who engage in academia and bring God to the table. But generally speaking, as a neuroscientist or a philosopher of the mind, for you to even entertain God as an academic question for the explanation of consciousness, it doesn't even pass the dinner table test. Yeah. So you could see there are secular assumptions here. There are naturalistic assumptions, or there is the assumption of philosophical naturalism, which is basically the philosophy that there is no God, there is no divine, there is no non-physical, and everything can be explained by physical processes or in reference to physical processes. So that tends to create an academic culture or a culture, an environment of denying God. And they would have God replacements, right? So they would create theories that sound like God, like panpsychism. Well, it doesn't sound like God, but it tries to explain consciousness in a way that refers to consciousness in a non-physical way. It doesn't refer to physical processes. Even like, when you hear about the multiverse, that there are infinite number of universes with the power to bring this universe into existence. That sounds like a God replacement, right? So academia, because it's based on, secularism in some sense, because the secular world promotes this type of academy, it's going to have that. I wouldn't say it's materialistic, but it would have that. The secular assumptions would be there to a certain degree. I mean, we can't be naive. There's no such thing as a, totally 100% objective, education system or academy. It just doesn't. It doesn't work that way, and it would be naive to suggest otherwise.
Okay. It would be a very personal question if you allow me to ask. And you have mentioned it earlier that you have changed and you have evolved. So, what is that change that you have mentioned? And what is the earlier version of Hamza Tzortzis and what's the after version of Hamza Tzortzis?
Well, I don't think there's a before and after. It's more of a slow transition. Yeah. Well, hopefully towards getting better, right? But that's for everyone else to decide. It's for Allah to decide.
So, do you have any guilt or kind of regrets?
Guilt? I don't know. Guilt? You maybe regret. There were probably things that I've said that I shouldn't have said. There are methods that I adopted that maybe I shouldn't have adopted. There are ways of being that I shouldn't have adopted. And that's part of life. I mean, as long as you are hopefully sincere, you have a Allah-centric, Akhara-centric vision. Your vision in this dunya, you're trying to, fulfill that vision with a certain strategy for the sake of Allah and because you want Jannah. So as long as you have that and you have good people around you and you stay as humble as possible, then I think Allah can take you on a journey. And it's all an undeserved gift anyway, whatever we do for the deen. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the 49th chapter talks about essentially the Arabs who felt that Iman or faith was a favor onto the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They were doing him a favor. But Allah responds and says, say to them that you being a Muslim essentially is a favor from Allah. So if Iman, if being a Muslim is a gift, is a favor from Allah, then what about calling other people to Iman? It's an undeserved gift. So if you stay humble, you understand this, then hopefully Allah will take you on a journey. But yeah, I mean, I've made mistakes, of course, 100%. There are ways of being and methods that I adopted and things that I've said that I should not have said. But I think the art of living, if you want to use those terms, the art of living is admitting your mistakes, improving, having people above you, like scholars and people of knowledge, having good people around you to hold you to account, engaging with the right, how can I frame this? Engaging with the essential areas of Islam, such as tazkiyat al-nafs, dealing with your nafs, with kibr, with ujub, with vanity, with hasad, with blameworthy jealousy, and with riya, ostentation, showing off. If you understand these are the core diseases of the heart, we have to work on them. And the best way to work on them is your aqidah, really, because the scholars of tazkiyat al-nafs, they say that the way to deal with hasad and kibr and ujub and riya is to focus on the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, there are other things like dhikr and dua and tadabbur of Quran, for sure. But primarily it's focusing on Allah's names and attributes, studying Allah's names and attributes. I believe if you study Allah's names and attributes, you won't have doubts. Of course, you will have no doubts you know shubuhat, no destructive doubts, and it would clean your heart, help your heart a lot, and it will keep you as humble as possible. And the other important thing that the ulama of Tazkiyat an-Nafs say is that you have to have good company, good people around you.
Okay, so tell me, when we read Quran, there is a major concept of Akhira, the hereafter in Quran, and as a Muslim, we do believe about it. So, why the concept of Akhira is essential for a human being? And let's suppose if we minus the concept of Akhira and if we add the concept of Akhira, so how it's going to impact on human psychology?
Yeah, I mean, the concept of Akhira is a great equalizer, right? I was speaking to this Japanese.
Equalizer, that's
Yeah, so I got that from Salman Sugimoto. He's a Japanese convert. I had a conversation with him.
Salman
Sugimoto.
Sugimoto.
Yeah, it was in Tokyo, and I had a meeting with him. So we wanted to hire him for IERA. I was the IERA CEO, and we went over there to do some activities and Dawah training and so on and so forth. And I had a meeting with him, and I asked him about his conversion. And essentially, and this was really interesting, especially from the point of view of a Westerner, because I never saw it that way. Or it wasn't, it wasn't a main thing that I was thinking about. I didn't have that focus. Basically, he was so worried about the injustice in the world, the inequality in the world, because he went to Bangladesh because his friend was Bengali studying with him. And he saw this inequality. What is going on? How do I explain all of this? There are rich, there are poor, and so on and so forth. And when he read the Quran, he said, that's it. I get it. In the Akhirah, everything is equalized, right? No one's going to be treated unjustly. Everything's going to be put into its place. And for him, the Akhirah had a powerful impact on him. And I think that's one of the reasons why he became Muslim. So number one is the great equalizer. It explains inequality, injustice, and all of these things. Because at the end of the day, it's all going to get sorted out in the divine court. That's one thing. The other thing gives you a sense of meaning, like ultimate meaning and purpose. Because at the end of the day, without Allah, without the Akhirah, if you just believe your end is the grave and you're going to become worm buffet, a buffet for the worms, you're just going to be a rearrangement of carbon, then you have a transient life. You have a life that just ends in the grave. So what is the real difference between an angel and a devil? What's the real difference between Hitler and Moses? They're both the same when it comes to the grave, just a rearrangement of carbon. So you get a sense of, you have a basis for ultimate meaning and ultimate purpose in life, the Akhirah, because it's eternal, it's forever. So anything that you do is going to have implications in the Akhirah. The other thing is, from a human psychological point of view, human beings like pleasure, they don't like pain, right? Even when people say it's self-sacrifice, there is no self-sacrifice really, because if you think about it, take Rachel Corrie, the famous American lady who sacrificed herself for Palestinians. She was bulldozed by the Zionist bulldozer and she died. Yes, that's sacrificial. But the pain of her not being there, not doing something about the injustice, was greater than the pain of her being there. So it was still an outweighing of pain and pleasure, right? So the Akhirah is the greatest pain or the greatest pleasure. So if you're smart, you're going to go towards the pleasure, right? If you have true self-love, Al-Ghazali, he talks about self-love, not like narcissism or ego, but rather self-love, meaning you want good for yourself. Yes, you want good for yourself. You want khair for yourself. And, the closest thing to you is you. And if you don't want good for yourself, how are you going to want good for others? If you don't love yourself in that way, how are you going to love others? And even Eric Fromm, the psychologist, I believe, he mentioned something very similar in his book, The Art of Loving. Like you have to have this, it's like a mature self-love. You're not a narcissist. You just want good for yourself. I want Akhirah, I want Jannah. Right? I want Jannah, I don't want Jahannam. And through that, you would want Jannah for other people as well. So this is the kind of profound aspects of the Akhirah. And also accountability. Right? I think in some of the accounts of, I think it was the Christians who were put into prison under communism and they were tortured like crazy. I think the fingernails were pulled out, and the communist Russian guards, they basically said, there's no accountability, there's no hereafter, we could do what we want. So if you really are conscious of the Akhara and accountability, then anything you say, anything you do, you know you're going to be held to account. And that gives you a sense of responsibility and a sense of consciousness and awareness that you have to be more wary and careful about the way you behave and the way you act. And it also gives you a lot of hope as well. You know, you have a sense of ultimate hope. You know, if you want to define the human being, one of its definitions is that we seek hope, right? There's light at the end of the tunnel. And if you think about, and this relates to the point of the Akhira being the greatest equalizer, you know, there's poverty and injustice in the world. Now, you may have a great life, but when you're 80 and 90, you're going to be on your sickbed, dying of cancer, in pain. There is no hope for continued pleasure unless you believe in the Akhira. There's no hope for continued pleasure. What about if you had a whole life of pain? There's no hope of stopping that pain. The only hope is the Akhira. And it's very beautiful because there's a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, and I'm paraphrasing the hadith, that if someone suffered the whole life and they were placed in Jannah for a split moment, they would be asked, did you ever suffer? They say, Wallahi, I've never suffered. So, you know, all of those things, it just makes sense. And people say, oh, well, you have to believe in the unseen. This is blind faith. No, it's not. The Quran says it. The Quran is the greatest testimony.
You're saying Akhira is not unseen.
Yeah, it is the unseen.
It's not unseen.
Akhira is unseen for us now. And they're saying it's the unseen. Why would you believe in it? It's blind faith. Nuh-uh. This is true haqq, true faith. This is yaqeen. Why? Because Allah, the greatest authority, told us. And we could prove that the Quran is from Allah. Do you see? If your friend said to you, your house is on fire, and you believe them the house is on fire. This is ilm al-yaqeen, yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
You don't need to say, oh, prove it to me. You run and you solve the problem. That's unseen for you, right?
Exactly.
You believe him because of his testimony. Allah's testimony is greater than a human's. And we know the Quran is from Allah, and we could prove the Quran to be from Allah. Also, if you have a problem of the unseen in terms of you cannot empirically touch it in the dunya, that's a false argument as well. Here's a perspective. 100 years ago, if you told them about the iPhone, if you told them about the electron, if you told them about quantum physics and all of these unseen things, for them, they would never believe you. They think you're crazy. But we know they exist now because we have some kind of empirical evidence, directly or indirect evidence. So for you to say, just because I cannot empirically see it, it doesn't exist, it doesn't follow. Because there are so many things that we believe to be true, even scientifically, and we can't see them. Can you see gravity? You could see the effects of gravity, but can you see gravity? Can you see subatomic particles? No. You may see the effects of subatomic particles, but you don't see them directly. And even if some scientists were to see them, you haven't seen them, but you believe it because you read it in a scientific textbook. There are so many unseens. What about your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother? Did she exist? She had to exist because you won't be here today. Do you have any empirical evidence? No, you don't know where her grave is. You don't have access to her DNA, nothing. So it's a really shallow argument to say, because I can't see it, I'm not going to believe in it. This is what we would say in very nice, posh, poetic, classical Urdu. This is bakwas.
Exactly. Okay, so you have talked about empirical evidences. So our whole academia is based on empirical evidence, that in order to get belief, in order to get conviction, you have to prove that thing from the empirical evidence. And what is that empirical evidence? That you have to see it, smell it, or touch it. Otherwise, they are not gonna believe on anything. So when we see this whole thing in from the Quranic perspective, Quran says, Alladhina yu'minuna bil ghayb. Our Quran starts with Alladhina yu'minuna bil ghayb, that we believe on unseen. And this whole concept is basically talking about seeing is believing. So basically, don't you think it's a contradiction between two things? And how are we gonna solve it?
Not really, because you would use an empirical method for empirical things, right? So the scientific method is a great method. It was actually given to us as a gift from the Muslims as well. I'm not saying it came from the Muslims, but we were part of the process. For example, Ibn al-Haytham, I think he wrote a book, it's called On Optics. It was the 10th or 11th century. He's been cited by Philip Mansell, a historian of science, as a key contributor to the scientific method. So one could argue that the scientific method was as a result of Islamic tradition, and he was Islamically motivated, Ibn al-Haytham, because he wrote in his autobiographical works that basically he wanted to find out the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the physical cosmos. Because for us as Muslims, the physical world is a manifestation of Allah's names and attributes, right? This is the beauty of nature, for example, and the interconnecting principles of nature. This shows the wisdom, the power, the creative agency, the rububiyyah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yeah, he's the great nurturer. He is the Rabb, the Lord of everything that exists. He's the divine creative agency behind everything. So, the scientific method is part of the Islamic tradition in a way, or the Islamic environment, So we're not against it, but use the method in its proper place. So if I want to discover something about this cup and the liquid in this cup, I'm going to use the empirical method because that's the correct method for this approach. But the method is not universal from the point of view, it can't be applied to everything. Because the scientific method, for example, has its own assumptions. One of its assumptions is a understanding of causality. Generally speaking, that there are external causal relations, that the causal link, there is an understanding of the causal link. But this is not a scientific issue. It's a philosophical issue. You have to adopt it as an assumption. Another assumption in the scientific method is that nature is uniform, right? You have to assume that nature is uniform. Like, I think Professor Okasha, in his introduction to the philosophy of science, he says this is one of the assumptions of science, that you have to believe that nature is uniform. Because if you didn't believe nature is uniform, you could not have scientific knowledge. Because when I have a successful scientific theory that has empirical confirmations and it has predictive power, you have to assume nature is uniform, because you have to apply that well-confirmed theory to the rest of the observations that you haven't observed yet, or the rest of the empirical phenomenon that you haven't observed. I'll give you an example. If I have an empirical theory, a scientific theory that talks about biological change, let's call it Darwinism, and Darwinism explains biological change. They say Darwinism has a lot of empirical confirmations and it has predictive power, so it's a well-confirmed successful theory. Now, but Darwinism, or the scientists, haven't seen all of biological change. But what scientists would say, especially if they're scientific realists, they would say Darwinism explains all of biological change, all of evolution, right? Biological change. But they haven't seen all of biological change. The reason they say it explains all of biological change is because they assume nature is uniform. Because if it works for what we have observed so far, and it's well confirmed it has predictive power, then it's going to work for things that we haven't seen yet. But that would only work if you assume the non-scientific assumption, it's a philosophical assumption that nature is uniform. So the reason I'm saying this is because the domain of the scientific method can, yes, it's a great method that we use, but don't think, now all of a sudden the scientific method can solve existential questions, moral questions. It can pay your taxes. It could do with political problems. It could do with mathematics. No. In actual fact, you have to have mathematics as well before you do science, really. And even what about the idea of logic or logical conclusions? In logical arguments, you have a deductive argument, for example. And then in a deductive argument, the conclusion is guaranteed by the truth of the premises. In other words, the conclusion necessarily follows. That logical necessity can't be explained by science. In actual fact, one would argue the idea of logical inference and the idea of deduction, you have to have first before you even do science. So it's prior to the scientific method. The reason I'm mentioning this is because the scientific method is not philosophically free. The scientific method has its domain, but it can't address everything. So for you to say now, can the scientific method prove God's existence? No. Can the scientific method reject God? No. Technically, the scientific method can't do either. But can you use the scientific method to form conclusions that you can use in a philosophical argument for God's existence? Yes. Can you use the scientific method to form scientific conclusions that you can use as data to try and disprove God's existence? Yes. They're not strong arguments. They're called evidential arguments, yeah? They're not strong arguments, but it's not science itself. Science really stays silent on God, right? It's how you use the scientific data with a rational or philosophical argument that you can either prove or reject God's existence, yeah? So the design argument is an empirical argument, really. You look at scientific data, especially modern forms of it, the teleological argument, and you rationalize over it or you philosophize over it to develop a strong argument. It's not a scientific argument. Yes, you use scientific data, but the data or the conclusions you use as part of a wider philosophical argument. Is this clear? So, Muslims should love the scientific method, but they should also be learned in the philosophy of science, because it would expand your mind. It would teach you that the scientific method has limitations. The scientific method has a scope. It can't address everything. It can't address things like purpose of life or existential questions or even moral questions about moral ontology, meaning the nature and source of morality. It can't really deal with that. Yes, maybe evolution theory can have some theories here and there, but if you are a moral realist, you believe in objective moral truths, science doesn't give you the foundation for objective moral truths. So the point I'm trying to say here is, science is a great method, but leave it in its place, right? Once you start using the scientific method and you apply it to other domains of knowledge that it can't really deal with directly, then that's where the problem lies.
When we read our Muslim history, there was a golden Muslim era with plenty of scientists, Muslim scientists, and with full of invention and innovations. But nowadays, we see lackings, and we see that Muslims are not part of that league. So why? I mean, why is this happening?
Well, because we're suffering from post-colonial trauma. That's what it is. And we're getting over it.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. And once we have authority again, because this is really a political problem, not a religious problem, yeah? Well, actually, those words are wrong, because the deen is political as well. This is what I would call a problem of authority, not a problem of spirituality per se. This is a problem of our understanding of the deen and its implementation on a social political level. When we have the deen at the highest level, in the right way, according to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, spreading mercy and justice everywhere and inspiring people, then you're going to have the golden age again, inshallah. Because people think, Muslims are backward. No, Muslims are suffering from post-colonial trauma, and they're suffering from us trying to rediscover our own social political identity. And once we get that done, I think we will have the space, the resources, the power, the authority to actually move forward. But in general, yes, Muslims should engage with the sciences and be productive and to be of benefit to humanity. The Prophet ﷺ talks about that, one of the most virtuous things that we can do is be of benefit to others, benefit to human beings, all human beings. So Muslims should be encouraged to engage in the sciences and in the various academic and professional fields in order to be best versions of themselves and to be the best in that particular area, and to ground that in Islam, to ground it in the Islamic values and tradition, and to be motivated by Islam to actually benefit humanity. So, obviously we're dealing with it, inshallah, slowly.
Inshallah. So in a macro perspective, what do you advise on our education system? Where do we lack? Where do we have to enhance and improve our education system or our tarbiyah model?
I'm not an educational specialist. I can't really comment on that, but I have some ideas with regards to, in general, the way we learn Islam is problematic. We need to revive the classical understanding, because the way we learn Islam in a very secular manner. We have secularized our knowledge. We think ilm is,
Can you elaborate the classical manner?
yeah, I'll do that. So let me tell you what the problem is first, yeah? So the problem is that we think that ilm, knowledge, is just memorizing. If I memorize hadith, I memorize a matan, a text, I memorize the Quran, I have ilm. No, you don't.
You have the understanding, basically.
Well, my phone has ilm then. There's Quran on here, there's hadith in here. Do you see? It's part of ilm to memorize, but it is not ilm holistically. Because when Allah talks about ilm, He talks about how it changes you. So when Allah says, are those who know like those who don't know? So just before, what does Allah say? They stand in prayer, right? They hope for the mercy of their Lord. They fear the punishment. They have, and in other places they have taqwa and so on and so forth. So, and Imam Malik, there are, I think, 2 narrations that attribute to him. He talks about that ilm is not just memorization. Ilm is a nur that Allah puts in your heart, right? So ilm is not just memorizing, it's internalizing. So look at the method of the Sahaba, how they memorize Quran. The funny thing is we always say, oh, follow the Sunnah, follow the Sahaba. But we don't do it when it comes to Quran. When it comes to Quran, we get the boy, we say, you have to memorize in 9 months the whole Quran. Or they'll get tappar, yeah?
Upper.
This is not the right approach. This is the wrong approach, in my view. The right approach is like the Sahaba. When they had about 10 verses, they would internalize, memorize, actualize, would become part of the spiritual DNA. They applied it, and then they will move forward. I think Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, took him 9 years to memorize Surah Al-Baqarah, yes? Long time. If one of our children take 9 years for one Surah Al-Baqarah, khalas, we'll get rid of him, right? We say, no, get out of the class, you're wasting our time. Yeah, so we need to revive the internalization of knowledge. So memorization does not give rise to transformation. It's the beginning of it, but there needs to be a process. And the process is to stop, pause, think, do tadabbur, make sure you live the knowledge. You become the knowledge. It changes your way of being. What's in your heart, what's on your tongue, and your actions, how you relate to yourself, how you relate to Allah, and how you relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this in my view is the classical way of learning.
Inshallah, this will be our last question, and this is regarding the da'is, preachers, those who are preaching religion. We see many young people, they came passionately and they started giving da'wah very passionately. And then after a certain time, they left da'wah, they left this field, and they start their ordinary life, they pursue their ordinary life. So my question is, why this happens, and what are the causes and the reason behind it?
I don't know. I don't know. It could be because they did it for the wrong reason. It could be because they didn't have a vision. It could be because they didn't have support, or they didn't have a good environment to support them. It could be that life challenges hit them. They had life challenges and they had to actually make money and feed their wife or wives. Yeah. Do you see my point? So I don't know. I can't assume a particular reason, but I think what's important is that every Muslim da'i needs to have a vision for their life, how they see the world. My vision is a world that is convinced of Islam. So that's my C. My B, who I must be convinced of Islam to the best way possible, in the most optimal way. And I must have the greatest conviction. And I must be able to convince others of Islam. So that means I have a lot of things to do. So that's my C. My B, now I have a to do. What's my do? My do is I have to learn Aqidah to become strong and firm in the deen. I also have to learn applied aqidah, how to apply aqidah in a contemporary times, in the contemporary, in contemporary context, the different isms around the world, the different worldviews. I also have to have tazkiyatun nafs, deal with my heart, because yaqeen is not just intellectual concept, it's part of the qalb, because the qalb, the taqallub, it wavers. And the qalb has to be qalbin salim, as Allah says, sound heart. And the qalb has two fitan, main fitan, shubuhat and shahawat, doubts and desires, blameworthy desires and destructive doubts. And it has diseases, kibr, ujub, riya, and so on and so forth. So we have to make sure the heart is spiritually strong, because the aql, according to the majority of the ulama, is a function of the qalb. So it's not just good learning in an abstract sense. You have to take care of your heart, because the aql is part of the qalb. So if the qalb is diseased, your aql khalas. Yeah? So that's important, that the du'at need to focus on. And so tazkiyatun nafs is important, learning aqidah. Oh yeah, having a vision. Sorry, so talking about my do. So my do is I need to focus on aqidah, focus on tazkiyatun nafs, and now I need to learn how to give dawah to others as well. So my actions are linked to who I must be and my global vision. And that global vision is Allah-centric, Akhara-centric. I'm having this vision because I want Jannatul Firdaus. And I'm having this vision because I'm doing it for the sake of Allah. So it's Allah-centric, Akhira-centric. So when the du'at have a vision, then things are more clear. They know where they're going. They know what they need to do. And it's connected to the aqidah, connected to that motivation that I want to please Allah. And I want Allah's word to be the highest. And I want to enter Jannah. So that's my advice for the du'at. And for them to also be on to be careful about the sincerity, the ikhlas. They have to be wary of riyah, which is showing off, and sum'ah, which is showing off by wanting people to hear about things. Yeah, there's two types of ostentation. Yeah, so, and that is an issue of the qalb, and we have to work on our heart, the spiritual heart, as we said, through dhikr, through tadabbur of Quran, through tahajjud, through istighfar, and all of these things, and having good people around you. So if you focus on ikhlas and you focus on a vision, and you have good people around you to support you, then you're less likely to leave the dawah.
Jazakallah khair for having this podcast with us at Al-Midrar Institute. And our prayers are always with you. May Allah preserve you, may Allah protect you, and may Allah accept it from you in this world and Akhira.
Ameen.
ये थे हमारे हरदिल अजीज़ हमज़ा ज़ोर्ज़िस, जो कि यूके से हमारे पास तशरीफ़ लेके आए थे, और इंतहाई अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह ताला मुदल्लल तरीके से और रैशनली और फ़िलोसॉफ़िकली इन्होंने बहुत सारे उन आर्गुमेंट्स का जवाब दिया जो कि आज के दौर में हमारे सोसाइटी में परवान चढ़ रहे हैं या सवालात जन्म ले रहे हैं। अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह, इंशाअल्लाह ज़िंदगी रही, अल्लाह की तौफ़ीक रही तो एक नए पॉडकास्ट के साथ, एक नए टॉपिक के साथ आपकी खिदमत में हाज़िर होंगे। तब तक के लिए इजाज़त दें। अस्सलामु अलैकुम व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू।